Okay, everyone. So welcome to the latest Tivian customer webinar. The focus of this is analytics as a service. And what we're going to do is look beyond our product offering and take a look at the services and dashboards that our excellent BI team can deliver. So, as always, I'm here, but for those joining for the first time, my name is Jay Hartley and I'm the Customer Success Manager for the UK market. Though I have to say I do love the opportunity to reach beyond the UK market and present to some of our global customers during these webinars. With the focus being on our BI team, it seemed remiss not to have one of them join me today. So David, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jay. Hi, everybody. So I'm David Kellis, Principal BI Consultant with Tivian. And I've been with the company now for just over 4 years. And I'm typically one of the go-to guys in the BI department for analysing customer data, coming up with solutions to sort of big data problems, how best to present feedback. And I'm one of our key Tableau experts on the dashboarding side as well.
And looking at our agenda today, it's packed with insight, if you'll pardon the pun. David's going to start us off with a great introduction to the BI team, which will help you understand what role they could play in your insight gathering. We're then going to take a look at 4 separate customer case studies, each with a different use case, but all with one common thread, and that's the excellent work of our BI team. For each of these, we're going to set the scene with a quick overview of the customer, the problems they face, and the solutions. Then it's going to be handing over to the expert, which is David, and he's going to delve into the project a little bit more and let you see the outputs of all of the hard work. We'll then close with a Q&A, so please be sure to add any questions via the webinar panel as we go. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Jay. So in terms of the BI team within Tivian, we are basically a global team within the company, and we are a sort of dedicated consultancy and implementation resource. We focus on analysing customer problems, implementing data-related solutions, and we offer a wealth of experience coming from a diverse background within the sort of business and IT world. We sort of combined between us, we've got over 50 years of combined industry insight. So we're kind of, I want to say we're almost like another product in Tivian's arsenal, in effect. We can be drawn upon to just get involved in data issues, analysing what's available, trying to see patterns, that kind of thing. And that means we can then draw on the tool sets within Tivian to solve said problems. So bringing into account the enterprise platform, the enterprise feedback platform, and other tool sets like the visualization suites that we use, such as Tableau, and all our data manipulation tools. So we sit there and we can be drawn upon as a resource.
Thanks, David. And we're going to now take a look at our first case study, which is looking at customer feedback. So the customer in question was a digital TV services provider. And as you can imagine, with that type of, in that type of industry, there's lots of customer interactions. There's lots of different data coming back and forth. And typically, there's not always a perfect solution for pulling all that together. So the problem they presented to us was exactly that. They had large volumes of data and it was live data. So it was coming in from different customer journeys. So it might be that you have a new customer coming on board and you're trying to find out how interested they are or how happy they are with their onboarding process. Similarly, you might have a customer that's not so happy and they might be leaving. And you might have somebody who you're offboarding or exiting. And all of that data was being captured through our solution, wasn't being captured through our solution, was being captured, but not in any consistent way. It was coming from lots of different formats. And basically, it was very hard for them to identify any root causes to any issues, any good things, and any improvements that were being made, because all of that data was kind of just jumbled up in their systems. So the way we worked with our customer here is that we actually sat down, asked them to tell us everything that they had, all the data sources that they could have. Some of it was from surveys, other was just from kind of their own internal systems. And we asked them, is there a common thing amongst here? And they identified the customer ID. And the great thing about that was that meant that we could then link lots of these different data sources together. As you can imagine, with all those different data sources, from a pragmatic level, if you were to just kind of throw all that together, it would be something that would be very difficult to handle, difficult to manage. So where David and his team came in and kind of identified the best way of working with that data, they identified a performance data source which ensured that it could both handle the large data sets, but also make sure that it was making the connections and kind of bringing everything together. So there's a lot of work that was done before you even get to the point of producing the dashboard. Once that dashboard was in place, that was actually able to then effectively track how customer sentiment was changing over time. It would be able to identify whether there was any differences between those customer journeys. So, you've got customers that might just onboard and they just sort of sit there with their core service, but there might be others that are purchasing more services along the way, and you'll be able to see how those things are developing. And then the final thing that we're obviously looking at doing there is actually being able to drill down into the specific question by a customer demographic. So there's no point kind of like having these great big themes of data without them being able to get down into the detail. And again, the solution that we produced there ensured that the end user, the end customer, would be able to delve into that data to the level that they needed, so that they could then put together some action plans off the back of it. And then the final step was to then actually see what was developing following all of that work. So again, the dashboard that we produced allowed you to identify areas for improvement and then also assess what the impact of those changes might be. So I'm now going to hand over to David, and he's actually going to probably expand on that and take us into the solution itself.
Super, thanks for that, Jay. Hopefully you can see the sample dashboard that I've pulled up on screen as I've swapped windows. So I'm going to focus on each of these case studies on the end results, on the end dashboard that we produce out of this, on the data. And as Jay was saying, speak a bit to the process that we went through to get here. So as mentioned, this customer had several key notes to emphasize: volume of data, the different sources of data, and the journey each customer went on, and tracking where improvements came about. So because of the volume of data, one of the things we had to look at first was how to make the data source as efficient as possible. And this is one of the areas we come into for expertise. And what we often try and do, and I'm actually in Tableau here at the moment, just showing you some of the data source setup here. But we try and streamline all the different sources of data. So rather than having 5, 10, 15 different sources of data, unify that into a single stream where possible, and build in any of our demographics and additional sort of feeds of data coming from the survey into that single stream. We can do some optimization on that data as well. So we use a tool set called Alteryx, where we can actually manipulate the data in the databases itself, and that's provided just purely for our access internally, because we can provide some of our tool sets to customers, but if it comes to database manipulation, it's something that we very much do in-house for security. So we worked on the data model for this to get what turns out to be hundreds of thousands of customer responses into as streamlined a fashion as possible. So the actual data sources are depicted up here in the top left of the screen, and there aren't many because it's all been nicely streamlined. And what does that give us? Sort of typical views. There was a heavy emphasis on Net Promoter Score. The NPS was something that this particular customer wanted a heavy emphasis on. They wanted to be able to track it over time. So we had multiple methods of analysis. So I'm just highlighting the evolution tab we added in the top right. And one of the interesting versions of that was a rolling 4-week chart, where you could see how the NPS was being affected over a rolling 4-week period throughout the history of the data. And what they were very much looking for was when change occurred. So we built various different journeys throughout the dashboard. So let's just go back to a daily view. In fact, let's do weekly. That'll be cleaner. So we built lots of different journeys within the dashboard. People who had dealt with the sales team, who had had their service installed, who had dealt with the call center or had maintenance, or had simply had no interaction with the company whatsoever other than a survey that had come out. And as times evolved, we wanted to see where were the highs and lows, and they could relate this back to changes within the business. So when there were certain peaks of, I want to say, enjoyment within the service, often coincided to certain events that were happening with their service. So this was the kind of analysis we did. Some of the clever things that we added into the visualizations were things like a black and white mode, and that signified that you didn't have many responses, for example. So it made it very immediately recognizable to the customer what to look for, where there weren't many responses. And what we offered to the end customer as well was to try and get a reasonable distribution of responses where possible. So I'm using a small subset of the data here at the moment, but the full survey would target individuals based on their previous journey with the company. So rather than asking somebody if they'd spoken to the call center multiple times, you'd realize that they'd already dealt with the call center. So maybe their inquiry was they were at a different journey within the company. Was it maintenance? Was it something else? If you were brand new to dealing with the company, chances are that your best bet was to be surveyed about installation, because that was your first port of call. So we worked on a distribution of these responses to try and tackle everything that was coming through. And the survey itself was huge. There was a lot of information coming through, and I'm barely skimming the surface here, but we had hundreds of different questions coming through, and every one of those questions we wanted this ability to trace and track change. So you would constantly have this sort of similar visual throughout the dashboard using the company's color branding, and everything was about noticing when there was change. For example, the dip between June and July. That's an alert. That's something to flag up. What have we changed between now and then? And which questions, for example, in the satisfaction area have given us the biggest drop? So it might be down simply to TV content, because that's had quite a big change there. We've got quite a large negative sentiment towards TV content. And it just gets you to those answers as quick as you can. You want to dive down from your Net Promoter Score, see why it's dipped, see which areas or which stories have been most affected, and get to that data. So that's very much what we did with this, and provided the customers with a huge amount of filtering controls in order to be able to narrow down who they were looking at and which demographics to target. So let's go back to the slide deck. And if we move along to case study 2, Jay.
Thanks very much, David, and that's great to see it in action. So the second case study was on quality control data, and this was a large premium automotive retailer, and as you might be surprised to learn, they still had a very paper-based QC system in place, and they were looking to transform the whole process into a digital one. So we'll obviously be focusing on the BI side and the outputs, but just to kind of bring the whole thing to life, This was a paper process right from the checklist all the way through the various steps and ticking it off for approval. And then even the reports out the back end were also then kind of either manual or they were kind of loaded into a single system. So it's all very manual, not very reliable in terms of tracking. And the whole process was brought in to improve that flow. And then, most importantly, ensure at the end that there was much better oversight for managers within the business, so that they could ensure that the minimum number of inspections were undertaken per month, and also be able to delve into the data to find out if there's specific problems. So lots of data going into this system from lots of different retail outlets. And again, David and his team would then look at this and bring together a data model to make sure that all that data was being managed effectively. It also needed to be a quick, responsive dashboard so that managers could see exactly areas where they needed to maybe focus their energies. Similarly, if you are looking at this data set, you might have local problems which need to be addressed by the manager, but actually at a higher level, you might have a broader view. And again, the dashboard was split so that it would work at those different levels, so that different people would be able to see different outputs, different metrics as they were working through it. Again, trend was important to them, and they wanted to be able to check the performance level, how it was going. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is there a problem somewhere that they need to go and approach it? So again, that all of that data was used to provide insight in addition to the kind of core metrics, whether specific vehicles or processes were more prone to failure. Also, they might identify potential training issues, because not always was it a problem that somebody was just lazy. It might have just been that they didn't know how to do something. Equally, did the season, as in the annual season, or the region affect how certain issues were being identified? And then again, in addition, technicians were able to be then assessed by volume, and also the kind of main overviewer could sort of see any technicians that needed specific help. So that whole process was something that David and his team got heavily involved in. And I'll hand over to David and he can show you the outputs.
Super, thanks again, Jay. Yeah, exactly to all those points. What we were given in terms of the paper-based setup, as you can imagine, the lack of traceability, the lack of insight that gives you, it's very difficult to think of a lot of different things at once when you're just looking at a paper-based solution. So when you transfer this into the BI world and the dashboard world, similar to the first example, we can build a custom data model which brought in multiple facets of data. So not just the quality control data itself, but related information such as what an individual retailer's target is, for example. So every retailer, every retail outlet, sales manager has targets as to how many things they should quality check. It's a separate data feed. So we bring that in, merge it with the original feed. And of course, our other question was, what else can we offer from this data? It's one thing to just say, have you met your check quota this month and how many failed? It's another thing to actually give insight back to every single person that's using this data. And that can be as simple as saying, how many business days have you got left this month to meet your quota? It's not always immediately obvious when you're running through the month and you've got a paper-based output to then be able to look at the dashboard and go, you can see it here. I've got 3 business days remaining. Yes, how many have we got left to do? Oh, well, we're 54% complete on the data I've got here. So that would be alarm bells immediately. But I can also compare at a national level, everybody who's within my regions or dealership groups or the individual dealerships themselves. So things like controls to switch the type of view you're looking at, region, group, and retailer. See where the most failures are occurring. So compare one site against another. And then you want to get into the reasons behind that. So it's one thing, as I say, to just check quota. It's another thing to get down to the raw reasons and then break out a few of the key things that cause customers issues, the end customer. A lot of people, and one of the stories we were told was, you go to buy a new car oh, you go to get your car serviced, and a lot of cars, there's no noticeable difference now when a car is serviced. So many things are digital, and you used to, in the old days, really feel that your car had had some work done to it. So actually, the cleaning process is of utmost importance. So it has a breakout section across quite a few of the pages. You know, how many cleans have been failed or are considered to be not up to par. It's that sort of drill down level that we bring out. But the other aspect to this is, what else could we find out from this data? So we brought into play the ability to go into, let's just hide this one, go into each view and choose what it is you wanted to display from the available data. So it might be that you wanted to see whether over time particular service technicians were having issues, or particular vehicle models were having issues. So if I swap to vehicle model, for example, and then if I hide this one, I might find a trend across vehicle models. Maybe a new model has been released, or you're sort of a year on from a model having been released, and you start to find repeating problems coming up. So one of the side effects of this data is almost a precursor to model failures and being able to investigate it. It might not be the dealership or the technician's fault at all. It might be that there are simply inherent problems. That kind of insight is a side effect of the data, and something we as a team look to bring out from that data. So when asked, you know, what additional value could we bring to the customer, it was exactly that sort of insight. The ability to then bring in the classics, like trending it over time, see how many failures are occurring, where the most failures are, even getting down to the individual checkpoints within the survey. So are we failing a lot, for example, on washer fluid top-ups? It might sound simple, but you can get down to that granularity of detail, and then you know exactly who to go and talk to improve that process. You can look at the distribution of these checks. If you've got 30 technicians working at a particular site, are you making sure that you quality assess everybody evenly? And you make sure that everybody in that workforce is up to speed in terms of how they should be operating and what checks they should be doing. And all of that comes out in the dashboard. And one of the points that we do with quite a lot of our sort of outputs is to provide different visibility for different people within the organization. So I've got these colored tabs along the bottom where somebody who has national privileges sees a certain viewpoint. Somebody who has single retailership access has a different viewpoint. They have different tabs along the bottom here. So their whole experience is different depending on who they are. So let's just go back to the PowerPoint. And I'll hand back to you, Jay, for case study 3.
I was on mute there. And so we've looked at a couple of situations where customers know exactly their problems. This third one is actually slightly different, whereby a customer actually came to us, and again, they did have lots of data out there, but the main thing they actually identified, they didn't really have any linkage, and they wanted to know what more insight they could gather from it. So rather than coming to us and saying, can you tell us this, what they actually said was, here's a lot of data, can you investigate it, and can you try and find out if there's anything interesting that you can bring to life for us? So David and the team did exactly that. They took all of that data from the customer. It wasn't everything, it was a section of the data. They looked at what was in there, and actually what they identified was that within the data there was information around familial relationships, which, given this was a financial institution, that was actually something that was potentially quite interesting, because what they actually then looked at was identifying visualizations which could then pick out links between people both within the company and also across client and supplier networks. This then gave them an area where they could delve into to identify potentially where there might be conflicts of interest or maybe unfair treatment exists. So for example, you might have a situation where there's a bit too much nepotism going on within a department, or somebody's giving their brother lots of work. And again, this was something that David and the team actually looked into and brought to life. They were then able to then kind of add to the business, because it was basically monitoring employee integrity. And again, at the end, they were then able to provide an actual report and how that data could be related to other data. So kind of the next step that could be taken. I'll just hand back to you, David.
Thank you. So yeah, the visualization for this one, there's quite a lot less to this one than the previous examples. But what we got out of this was based on a very small subset of some of the data they had, as Jay said, to highlight what we could do with it. And we found relationship data, two forms of relationships really within the firm. It might be that you have got people who were related to external companies that maybe worked with the main company. And in those situations, you've then got the ability visually to highlight any firm within that list and maybe find firms of particular interest. So it might be, especially if there's a particular project that's going on, maybe it's useful to find somebody within the company who already has existing links to said firm, or maybe you do need to be careful about that because you're looking at conflict of interest, and maybe even if you're making project decisions, you need to assess that there is nobody related to that industry or to that business on the project team. Maybe you have to be completely anonymous in that sense. So we built very simple visuals that allow you to just click and filter and drill down to anybody who has that sort of relationship. And alongside that data came the ability to look at internal relationships within the firm. So we have some demonstration data here that did just that. You could look at different locations within the overall business, and you've got a series of locations where you've got a frequency of how many have other relatives within the business. And although it's easy to sound like a bit of a witch hunt, but you actually might need to find out this information because of employee integrity. Are people could be promoted for the wrong reasons, so you sometimes have to be careful. And obviously this is a very territorial thing. Different companies, different countries will operate in different ways for this sort of information. But we in the BI team just had a look through the data to find these sort of relationships, and then built a visual which allows you to highlight that. So using the colors and the heat map, you can quickly find locations and high intensities of relationship where this occurs. So you could find the service sector, for example, which might be people who operate on the telephones, on support calls and so forth, is actually one of the areas with the highest frequency of internal relationships within the company. And we got down to a point where you could actually see that, for example, a corporate vice president has a huge number of relatives within the service sector, and that was highlighted in the hover over tooltip, and we would just change the color of a particular individual to reflect, oh, this is somebody of interest. They've got more than a certain threshold of relatives working within the business. And you may then want to relate that back to other data that's occurring within the company. If, for example, you had a lot of people who were all related, all being promoted, you have to, for certain companies, that may raise questions in terms of employee integrity and so forth. So, as I say, we discovered that data from the available, we discovered those relationships from the available data that we had, and just built some simple visuals from it to get some feedback. And it makes it a lot quicker to analyze. So let's go back across to case study 4.
Thanks very much, David. And I'm conscious we're just at time, but we've got this one to go, so we will plow on for those that are still with us. So this last one was actually looking at quite a classic scenario. So this is a financial institution that basically ran performance and benchmarking comparisons for external customers. So as it stands at the moment, they run those, and then at the end they generate a 70-page report, which, as I'm sure you could all imagine, is not exactly the most consumable report. It was hard to compare results across business areas. It was very difficult to then look at that data and analyze or gain any insight. So whilst they were going through a lot of great work to produce something, the output that they were then providing to both their in-house and external stakeholders was not quite at the level that it needed to be. So the team took that on board, and what they actually did was again, they looked at the reports. They didn't just disregard the reports. They took a look at them and actually identified, well, what are the metrics that are key here? What is the commonality in amongst this for the reporting structure? And actually came back to the customer and said, right, well, we've taken a look and we've actually produced these wireframes of the reports that we think that will benefit your business. And what they showed was that you could actually identify and allow for targeted data analysis, again, cutting it down to a specific company and having a look. And also then taking some of the verbatim text from those kind of studies that they were undertaking, turning those into engaging visuals that really highlighted any key areas for customers to take a look at. As David mentioned, a lot of the time the BI team will use Tableau, and using that, they then produced the dashboards, which then gave much better insight to the end users, actually allowed people to build benchmarks based on a selected set of demographics on the fly, which could then be used within the dashboard itself. And then customer and the end customers had access to the same dashboard with different views, again, so that they could actually just review it, analyze it, look at it in meetings, and again, make much better use of all that great data that was being gathered. So I'll hand over to David for the final case study or demonstration.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, so as with everything Jay's just said, one of the things we'll do in an analysis of this sort, particularly where there's an existing large-scale report that people are familiar with, is to heavily analyze that report in itself, and particularly if you've got certain views even in that report that are actually very useful for us to pull out. It's not always worth completely reinventing the wheel, but where we can really add value is digitizing that and turning what was a 70-page report into what you can see along the bottom here in red. There's actually 5 separate key tabs in here. And one of the things that you can obviously do when you're in the digital world is to incorporate the use of filters and controls that are going to dynamically change those views for you. So part of our analysis involves looking at the commonality within those reports to see, well, rather than having 10 different pages where one slight thing changes on those pages, that for us is obviously a common view. You've got a filter control and you can change the way that you're looking and interpreting the data. With a lot of dashboards, you can also carry out an export process. If you want to export to a PDF or a PowerPoint, for example, you could make your filter settings and then download a copy of it if you want, so that you can view it offline. But we typically took a couple of the very, very useful views and improved them, and then took the common views and made those more easily changeable within the dashboard. And the point here was very much this whole comparison and benchmarking facility. Rather than having to compile all of this manually, if you've got it in the system digitally, once you've got it in a database, we can bring it into the dashboard and the user can dynamically change their comparator group. They can have the universe view of everything they've got. And particularly if it's for a specific industry or company. So in this case, we have a dummy data of an oil company in the energy sector. We can find the peers to that group. That's our comparison group. What are the like-minded or similar natured companies? And therefore, how do you compare against them? How do you compare against some of what we call the key pillars of this data? How are you rated against those? Where are the differences? And also the chart we have here, for example, is one that the customer had on paper. We liked the look of it because it let them see from a quartile perspective where a particular company sat in terms of key strategies and key pillars within the data, but you couldn't see much else on paper. But in the digital world, hopefully you can see the tooltip here. You can immediately bring more data to the customer. So as soon as you hover over, you can actually see where you sit against your peers, your competitors in the data, but all fully anonymized. You would just see data points and you could see where you lie. And part of the usefulness of this gives the company insight as to what areas do they need to work on to improve. But you haven't got to trawl a 70+ page report to get there. Within a few clicks, you're starting to see the areas where you sit above or below the norm, as it were. And these are the sort of visuals that we produced. One of them was also to find where there was lots of wordy questions, translating those into something more visual, because we know as experts in the area that it takes time to read through all the different text, and as soon as you can get a visual output to compare your results to somebody else, it's a lot easier. We all work better with colors and numbers and so colors and shapes and sizes and so forth. So that's very much where the dashboard came from, and was obviously a very good success in that sense. So let's go back just across to the slides and across to any questions.
So we just got one question actually, and I think this is a really important one, and it kind of helps me illustrate really that our BI team are a service that we can offer within the business. So the question is, how would I get a BI consultant involved in a project? So our BI team can work independently with you. So even if you're not using EFS, it doesn't necessarily, initially, it doesn't really matter, because the team can actually bring together data sources from other places and put them together and actually present them back. So if you've got other projects that you're maybe running which are research, or maybe other people in your business might be able to make use of us, please be sure to reach out to any of the people that you've had interactions with. So that could be me as your CSM. It might be that you've actually worked with David before. If you've got an account manager, reach out to them and just say, I've got this problem, I'd like to get it run past one of your BI guys. And then what we can do is we can have the initial discussion, we can work out what the steps might be, and then agree some kind of statement of work to cover the activity. As I say, it might be like the digitization journey. It might be that we say, well, actually, this is bigger than just the BI side. We actually want to bring in other things. Let's try and automate some of these things to then make the data capture much more streamlined, so that David and his team have got a really robust data set to work with. But again, they are an independent part of our organization. They can work with you on a purely consultative basis, and it doesn't matter if you aren't working directly with us on certain areas. So I think that closes out for today. Conscious of time, and we haven't got any more questions in, which is great. So I just want to say thank you all for joining with us, and sorry we ran over by a few minutes there, but thanks for those that stayed on. As always, there'll be a recording of this produced and shared via our YouTube channel, and I'll also be getting a survey out to you guys to see what you thought of the content. So I'll say goodbye, and David, I'm sure he would like to say thank you too.
Oh, thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure.